And we tried to make it to where we could keep some of that in our minds. I don't expect us all to be able to name them, just all the time, but just to kind of, all right, this Herod was here, this Herod was there, and this is the Herod that did this, and all of these types of things, just so we can kind of, it'll help us when we get into the ministry of Christ a little bit deeper. Let's go in, if you have your worksheet, you can just read off the answers that we got so far, but by way of recap, Herod the Great ruled for how many years? 33. And the Romans declared him to be what? King of the Jews. King of the Jews. Does that phrase ring a bell in another situation completely? Where else do we read someone being the King of the Jews? Jesus. It was put on the cross, right? And remember what they wanted him to say? No, don't say that he was King of the Jews. Say that he said he was the King of the Jews. And he said, what I've written, I've written. That's interesting, isn't it? Herod was known for his elaborate building projects. Just name a couple of the things that he built. The new harbor in Caesarea, that's good because we're going to be in that area a lot in the ministry of Jesus. Anything else? Herodian fortress. Remember he rebuilt the walls and the stones that were there when the disciples say, look, Lord, look at these big stones. Upon Herod's death, we're going to now see, this is where we're going into the next section, who ruled over each of these territories. Remember last time we were together, we talked about his death and just how paranoid he was. While he was on his deathbed, he had one of his sons killed because he thought he was trying to take over. And it wasn't going to go the way he went. Remember, he gathered all the Jewish nobles and had them at the racing track. And he commanded, upon my death, slaughter them all, so that there would be great mourning in the area. That's just the kind of man that he was. He was the one that wanted all the Hebrew baby boys to be killed. Just a psycho in so many ways. Just so power hungry was this man. But so when he died, and we discussed in depth, when he died, how he died, what it was like, and all of that. But when he died, his will was read, and his power was spread over without several different people. Look at Matthew chapter 2. And remember, a few weeks ago, I gave you Wayne Jackson's article on this topic. But Matthew chapter 2, verses 19 through 23. If you have a man with that much power, when he dies, there's a void that's left. I mean, and even if the world is better off without somebody like him, there's a vacuum that takes place. Remember when Saddam Hussein was killed, and the troubles that are still going on in Iraq with different people trying to gain control now. There's been a lot of turmoil because of that. Well, it's the case with Herod as well. In Matthew chapter 2, starting with verse 19, it says, now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. Let's stop right there, and we'll get to the rest of it later on tonight, Lord willing. But you just think about that, the power of one man. When he was dead, okay, Joseph, he's dead now, you can go back to that area. This is the type of man that we're talking about. Just an evil man in so many ways. So after his death, here's what the area was divided into. Archelaus was his son, and he ruled Judea. And this man was also vicious. He was a lot like his daddy. Very vicious, and he was to be feared. He was so vicious that the Jews and Samaritans appealed to Augustus for removal of him, and he was deposed in about AD 6 AD, and he was banished to Gaul up there. You see in the top right hand of that map, he was banished to that area. But after he was banished to that area, then the Roman governors ruled that area. It was ruled by Roman governors. The Romans said, well, all right, he's gone. Let's put some of our people in there to rule that land. The most famous of him is, can anybody guess? You're going to read his name, and it's going to be, especially in the trials of Jesus, who do you think was one of the most famous of these Roman governors? Pilate. That's exactly right. Pontius Pilate was one of these. And so that's how he got to be in power. So I know I might be nerding out a little bit too much on the history part of this, and we're going to get past this. But here comes this Pilate. Okay, Archelaus was banished. Let's put these people in here to keep all these people under control. And so this man who was really just a puppet king, puppet ruler, comes in there, and he's going to have something to say about the greatest event that's ever taken place in this world. And this man is put into this situation. It just boggles my mind how something like that can happen. So then you had Antipas, who retained rule over Galilee and Perea. I didn't bring my pointer tonight, but you see the green, there's Galilee. That's going to be very important because that's where Jesus grows up, in Lower Galilee. And so this is the one, Antipas, who was a ruler during that time. And then Perea, you see that just on the east side of the Jordan River, also in green. Jesus does a lot of work there too. So we're going to be spending a lot of time in these areas. And this is the man that was the ruler of this. He ruled there from 4 BC to 39 AD. And because he ruled a part of the kingdom, he was officially called a tetrarch, which is a ruler of a part. And look at Luke chapter 3, verse 19, just to kind of get us some perspective on this. Luke chapter 3, verse 19. But Herod the tetrarch, being rebuked by him concerning Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, and for all the evils which Herod had done. So he was allowed to keep the name Herod, but he was Herod who was a tetrarch, a ruler of a part, but he kept the Herod name. We're going to be reading a lot about him. He's involved with John the Baptist and with Jesus, as you can already see from Luke chapter 3, verse 19. And then you had Philip, who ruled as also a tetrarch, and he was over the northern regions. The mainly Hellenistic regions up there towards the north, Gaul and Decapolis, but especially Gaul in that area. He's the one that built Caesarea Philippi to distinguish from Caesarea on the coast. So you had Caesarea Philippi, then you had Caesarea on the coast. And so all these people have a part to play in this great story that we're going to be studying when we come to the ministry of Christ. And here you have these people that come into Jesus' life, some good, some bad, some cause a lot of problems. And so these are the men who were rulers during the time of Jesus. Now you can go a little bit farther. We won't do this for this class, but you look at Acts and you come up with some more Herods. Herod Agrippa, but we won't talk about them. They're all in this line. They're all in this line of leaders. Brother Waycaster last week, and I listened to the class, he did a great job on the birth and childhood of Jesus. And that's where we're going to start tonight, his childhood. And I want to say something, and I want to make sure that I make this very, very, very clear. I didn't make a worksheet for this because I didn't want you to write it down and then someday say, well, this has to be from the Bible. We're going to talk about some things tonight that you cannot find in the Bible. All right, and I want to make that clear. We're not teaching Bible for the next few minutes. What we're teaching is what all Jewish boys would have done if they were growing up in this area. And so we're going to make some assumptions, I think some pretty safe assumptions, but I want to make sure that you know that they are assumptions of what Jesus would have done if he was like a typical Jewish boy that grew up in this area. Okay? So let's make that plain. But before we do, let's finish the worksheet here. When Archelaus was banished to exile, who or what arrangement was made and ruled over Judea? You had the Roman governors. The most famous of one from question 5 was Pilate. And then, what three questions, and I told you we'd be coming back to these, we're going to repeat a lot of these things. What three questions should we continue asking ourselves as we study the life of Christ? And this is from the first couple weeks of class. Is this, and that should be an, essential teaching, or is it an illustration of the teaching? So fill that in and remember that. Is this an essential teaching or an illustration of the teaching? In other words, when we come to a parable, we don't want to get so caught up in the illustration that we miss the point of the parable, which is easy to do because, like with the prodigal son, there's so much that you can talk about in that. But if you dwell so much on that, then you miss what Jesus is really trying to teach in that great parable. So is it an essential teaching or is it an illustration of the teaching? And then this question, I hope you'll remember, am I living up to my best? Anybody remember? Light. That's good. Am I living up to my best light? And how can I make this truth live for others? As we're reading the ministry of Jesus, remember that's the question I want us to always be asking ourselves. We're not just reading this for a history lesson. We're reading this because if we're supposed to have the mind of Christ, we're going to be studying the mind of Christ. This is what He did. This is who He was. And if I'm supposed to be more like Him, then all throughout this study, I need to be asking myself, am I like this at all? Am I living like this? And if not, what corrections do I need to make? And then where I am, how can I bolster that and become even more like Him? The number 8, this is the big one. Knowing the blank, and the blank of the people of the Bible helps us have a fuller understanding of the text. You remember those three? Culture, that's right. What else? History, knowing the history of the people, the culture of the people, and the geography of the people. Helps us have a fuller understanding of the text. And so when we read about Herod, how I know which Herod that was, or I know how Pilate got to where he did. That seems weird the way that they did it. You know, I always, when I was reading about Abraham when he was dying and having his sons come in there and put their hands under his thighs as a way, well, that is just weird. But there's culture. And to understand the culture of something helps us understand why that was so important. So the culture, the history, and the geography of the people. And then, what word did Paul use that caused his audience to lose interest? Do you remember? Gentile. That's right. They listened to him until this word, just one word, and they were done. Now, that's a big deal to me because if I'm not willing to be fully dedicated to whatever the Bible says, then there's going to be one word that keeps me from doing it. There's going to be one word that will keep me from doing it. And that word might be different for all of us, but there might be one word that's going to keep me from being everything I can be as a Christian. And then this one, name one reason from the first week of class that we should study the life of Christ. We gave you several. Do you remember any of them? Don't everybody speak at once. There should be an obvious one. We're supposed to be like Christ, so we ought to study His life, right? All right, let's get to those things now. And this is, again, I want to just reiterate. We're going to be talking about some things, and I'll make it clear as we go throughout here. But this fascinates me. I don't know if it does you. And I often wonder, what was the boy Jesus like? Do you ever think that? When he was growing up, if he fell down, did his knees get skinned? Was he ever ornery? You know, did he have to go to school? And things like this. Now, the Bible is not written to satisfy my curiosity. Luke does tell us one part of it, and Tom talked about that just briefly last week. So that we can know. That is Bible. But let's fill in some blanks, perhaps, on what it was like for our Lord growing up when He grew up. Matthew and Luke tell the account of the birth of Jesus. And this was during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. And of course, Herod was still in power then. And of course, he was, because he was trying to have Jesus killed. But following their marriage, Mary and Joseph were forced to travel south to Bethlehem. And there again, you can see there where Samaria is in Judah. They were forced to go down south to Bethlehem. And there's a reason for that. Look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 4. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, and then it goes on. Verse 7, then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem. So all the way back when Micah said where he was going to be born in Bethlehem. And this, we need to appreciate this. What brought them to Bethlehem at that time, there's no other reason for them to be there. How in the world did Micah know that this is the place where it was going to happen? This would be the last place, in a lot of ways, where he should have been born. What caused them to get down there? Well, they were down there because they had to go to their ancestral homes, away from where they were living now. Everybody had to go back to their ancestral homes to be taxed. So everybody had to go back to their ancestral homes. So they go on down to Bethlehem, and this is where Jesus was born. And this Roman census, and just think about this. You talk about an instrument of occupation designed to control and tax. Just imagine if all of us in here tonight said, all right, we're going to tax you. Well, that's nothing new. What's so big about that? Everybody has to go back to where they came from so we can put you in your proper place and make sure that you're being taxed the right amount. What's that? Yeah. Well, just think, how many people would have to leave Memphis? Yeah, in this building, if you would have to leave Memphis to go back to where you came from to be taxed, raise your hand if you'd have to leave this area. Yeah, almost all of us. Almost all of us. You think that would be a hardship? Now, the thing about it is, you would go where the man was from. So, women, you would go where your husband would be from. So, think about that. That would be a little bit of a burden, wouldn't it? Cedric, you'd be going back to Texas, wouldn't you? Yeah. Diane's not looking at me, is she? You know what? I need to take my hand down. I would stay here in Memphis. This is where I was born. And so I would stay here in Memphis. Take that back. The rest of you would leave. I'd stay here. It wouldn't be so bad for me. But just think about that. And especially when you have Joseph and Mary. Were they rich people? Oh, they were poor. Do you remember what they offered? And see, this is what I mean. Just these little things that you can pick up on. When they dedicated Jesus, do you remember what they offered? 2 turtle doves. And why 2 turtle doves? Did they not care about Jesus? That was the poor people's offering. Even poor people could afford that. No doubt that still had to be a little bit of a burden, but they were poor. That just shows them just how poor they were. And so they go to Bethlehem. And once they get there, we talk about there's no room in the inn. You know, you'd have these places. And you imagine if everybody's having to go to their ancestral homes, how busy it would be. And these homes, for the poorer people, you would have mostly, you'd have a house where the family stays. And then right next to it, attached to the same house, would be where the animals were kept. And so there was no room in the inn. So where were they staying? Yeah. You think this was a hardship on them? And so here's this young Mary and Joseph, this poor couple, pushed into a distant village by the military forced into this peasant's hovel to give birth to Mary's firstborn son, named Jesus, who was the Christ. And so Matthew and Luke develop these different aspects of the story of Jesus' birth, and we won't go into all of this because Tom covered it so well last week. Matthew records the details about Joseph, the star, the attack of Herod's soldiers, and then look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. So now you get Mary and Joseph there because the purpose of having to travel there to be taxed, staying in this little shack, and then from there, all right, we've had our baby, let's go back home, we've done the taxing thing, but then they were warned, no, don't go back. They got to travel again and go further down into Egypt. Every time I travel going overseas, and I've always strived to be this way, even if I've been flying for 14 hours and I have jet lag. If there's a young mother up there with a screaming child, I try to have patience and pity because I would much rather be me listening to that child cry than to be that child's mother when you know everybody's wanting your child to be quiet. I feel for people who have to travel with young children. Now imagine what they were doing. Now they got to go further and go down into Egypt. And so Matthew tells us about that. Luke tells us the story of John the Baptist's family and birth, the visit of the shepherds, the purification of Mary, the naming of Jesus. And then he tells us about some people who did some singing. You remember who did some singing when Jesus was born? You had the song of, you have Mary, Zechariah, and Simeon. You hear from each of those three people. It's difficult to know exactly how long Mary and Joseph were in Egypt following the birth of the Lord. But we do know that they waited until Herod was dead, which was 4 BC. Since when they return, Herod's son Archelaus is now in power. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 2. So now, keep this in mind. Just thinking about what this poor couple was going through. Look at verse 22. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. What's that tell you about Archelaus? He's not much better than his father. And being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. So let's just put a couple prophecies together, all right? He's going to be born in Bethlehem. Micah 5 verse 2 tells us that. Why did they end up in Bethlehem at the time when Mary was to deliver a child? Because of taxation, something that somebody else did. So God, in His awesome foreknowledge, knows, and Tom did this well again in his class on Sunday, where God steps down into time and He sees time, though He's not bound by time. He looks down into time and said, okay, now when this happens, this leader is going to be making everybody go to their ancestral homeland, so he's going to be born not where they live, but where he's from. So they're going to be in Bethlehem at that time, and he tells us that. Now, he's not going to grow up there. He's going to grow up in this little village up in the northern part, Lower Galilee, in this little town called Nazareth. Well, why? Well, because Herod's son Archelaus is going to be, he sees all of this before it happens. And boy, if we could just, let me rephrase that. If I could just remember that every second of my life, it would cut down my worry 100%. Does God see the pain you're feeling now? Does He see the pain that you felt in the past? Does He know the pain you'll suffer in the future? But what about it? He's there. God is taking care not just of Jesus. Obviously, He's the main, not character, He's the main purpose of all of this. But Mary and Joseph are being protected by God too. And you wonder how much they understood when this was going on. All right, so they bypassed Judea. They settled in Galilee. Archelaus was deposed, like we said, in AD 6. And it's already 7:30. Let me just go through this. This is the part that I just want us to think about. Some of this will be supposition, I understand that. We do know that Jesus grew up in the Galilee village of Nazareth. You see it. It's not on this map. There it is. You see the Sea of Galilee up there at the top. Over there to the left, to the west, you see the little town of Nazareth. I put these up there. You can see it was kind of semi-mountainous where he was. I put that map in there. It tells you the rainfall that they have in that area. That's going above and beyond, isn't it? But anyway, that's where he grew up. Let me tell you a little bit about that. During this time, there was an expanding city, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Sepphoris. And the busy trade routes went right through or right around Nazareth. And so while Nazareth wasn't really a growing and bustling town so much, there was a Greek town that was being developed very close by. So you wonder, Joseph being a carpenter, that's where all the building was going on. Would they be going in that direction? You know, if you're in the construction business, you go where they're building. If that's what you do, you go where they're building. Probably Jesus was educated in the local synagogue from the age of 5 or 6 is when they started. Each afternoon, then, he would work in his father's trade. He would be, if he was a typical Jewish little boy, they would start almost with their kindergarten in the mornings in the synagogue. They would start their training. And then, yes, in the afternoon, even at a young age, they would go and start learning their father's trade. And I'll tell you where I get all of this information coming up. Joseph, Mark chapter 6, verse 3, was a carpenter, which refers to someone who works in wood, metal, or stone. If Jesus was like most of the other Jewish boys when he was growing up, from the ages of 6 to 10, he would become literate in the Hebrew language through the study of the Torah. And this would all be done in the synagogue that was located in Nazareth. And he would memorize, at this young age, vast amounts of Scripture. That's what they did. From the ages of 10 to 12, he would become acquainted with the oral laws. So he would study the Torah, the early part of his life. Ages 10 through 12, he would become acquainted with the oral laws, again, under the direction of the synagogue leader at that time. At this point, his schooling would end. I have a lot of young people in here, but imagine you go to your 12, you're educated. You're educated. You're done with that. So then guess what he would do? He would go to work all day with his dad and learn that trade. Probably wishing he was back in school. I imagine. That was what's typically done for Jewish boys. The only event from this time period was recorded in the Gospels is Jesus' visit to a Passover in Jerusalem. And what did he do there? You remember, they didn't find him as they were going back. And when they went back to Jerusalem, where did they find him? What was he doing? Sitting in the temple, discussing, and the leaders were blown away by his knowledge. So he was being educated just like the other Jewish boys during that time. And yes, I did say Jewish boys. The girls, not so much. If they got any education, it was from the home. The boys were the formally trained ones. And at the age of 13, until the time of his public ministry, Jesus, if he was a typical young boy growing up in that time, probably worked in Nazareth and joined the village men in the synagogue for discussion. The younger men were allowed to go in there mostly just to listen, but then they would listen to debates going back and forth, and that's what would take place in the synagogue. So, said all that to say this: he would have about 20 years of experience debating before he began teaching himself in the synagogues in Galilee. By the time he was an adult, he would have been a skilled craftsman, he would have been literate, he would have been knowledgeable in the traditions and history of his people, and he would be adept at public discourse. He had a well-rounded education, a very well-rounded education. And I love to think about my Lord growing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Where was that taking place as he was growing up and being trained? This next quote, and this is the last one, this is where we'll have to end. This tells you a little bit about where I got some of this information. Records found in the Rabbinic Judaism in the century after Jesus. So this would be the century after he lived. This is go back the digs that they did, the documents that they found. Give us some idea of what life was probably like in the first century. As a faithful Jew, Jesus likely traveled to Jerusalem yearly to celebrate Pentecost or Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. He was surrounded by the markers of his Jewish faith. The front door of his home had scriptures, likely Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, chapter 11, 12 through 21, nailed to the right upper post. He also dressed, if he was like the Jewish men in that time, in a long cloak with double tassels on each of the four corners of its hem. But unlike the Greeks, he made one thread at each corner blue, signifying his identity as a Jew. Twice each day he recited the Shema. That's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. I wanted to have time to read that, but we don't. Which explains how he can readily refer to it when asked in Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. He kept a kosher diet, wore his hair and beard long, and observed the many rules regulating the Sabbath. And there's the source of that quote right there. But I want to make this point clear. We often think of Jesus well, he doesn't need to be trained. He's God in the flesh. But he did. He was trained. He grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. He went to these schools. He was, if you were looking at him, a typical person as he was growing up. When he fell, he hurt. When someone close to him died, he felt that pain. He was well-rounded and nurtured as he grew up. And we're out of time. So fast. Good to be back. Appreciate so much everybody's attention.